Section 12 of Army Letters from an Officer's Wife, 1871, 1888. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sue Anderson. Army Letters from an Officer's Wife, 1871, 1888, by Francis Rowe. Section 12, Letters from 1880, Part 2. Fort Shaw, Montana Territory, August, 1880. The company has been ordered to proceed without delay to Fort Maginnis, a post that is just being established, and to assist another company in building temporary log quarters. The other company will go from Fort Missoula, and has to remain at the new post during the winter, but Fay's company will return here in November. We were all ready to go to the Yellowstone Park next week with General and Mrs. Bourke, but this order from Department Headquarters upsets everything. The company was designated there, and go it must, although Fay has been at Fort Shaw only 6 weeks. He has command, of course, as Colonel Knight is East on recruiting service, and the first lieutenant is abroad. General and Mrs. Bourke could not understand at first why I would not go with them to the park just the same, but I understood perfectly, and said at once that I would go to Maginnis with Fay. For to go in one direction where there is only a weekly mail, and Fay to go in another direction where there is no mail at all, and through an Indian country, was not to be considered 1 second. I was half afraid that the commanding officer might forbid my going with Fay, as he could have done, but he did not, and when he saw that I could not be persuaded to change my mind, an ambulance was ordered to go with the command, so I can have a shelter when it storms, for I shall ride Betty on the trip. The distance over is 150 miles, right across mountains and valleys, and there will be only a faint trail to guide us, and I am anticipating great delight in such a long horseback ride through a wild country. We will have everything for our comfort, too. Fay will be in command, and that means much, and a young contract surgeon, who has been recently appointed, will go with us, and our Chinese cook will go also. I have always wanted to take a trip of this kind, and know that it will be like one long picnic, only much nicer. I never cared for real picnics. They always have so much headache with them. We have very little to do for the march, as our camp outfit is in unusually fine condition. After Charlie's fixie of so much mess chest china, Fay had made to order a complete set for 4 people of white agate ware with blue bands. We have 2 sets of plates, vegetable dishes, cups and saucers, egg cups, soup plates, and a number of small pieces. The plates and dishes, also platters, can be folded together, and consequently require very little room. And it is a great comfort to know that these things are unbreakable, and that we will not be left without plates for the table when we get in the wilds. And the ware, being white, looks very nice, not in the least like tin. It came yesterday just in time. The 2 squirrels I carried to the woods and turned loose. I could not take them, and I would not leave them to be neglected perhaps. The tiger was still a tiger, and as wild and fierce as when he came from the sawmill, and was undoubtedly an old squirrel, not to be taught new tricks. The flying thing was wholly lacking in sense. I scattered pounds of nuts all about, and hope that the 2 little animals will not suffer. The Chinaman insisted upon our taking those chickens. He goes out every now and then and gives them big pans of food and talks to them in Chinese, with a voice and expression that makes one almost want to weep, because the chickens have to be left behind. We are to start on the 18th, and on the 19th we had expected to give a dinner, a very nice one, too. I am awfully sorry that we could not have given it before going away, for there are so many things to do here during the winter. The doctor has had no experience whatever in camp life, and we are wondering how he will like it. He looks like a man who would much prefer a nice little rocking chair in a nice little room. End of letter. Camp near Junot's in the Judith Basin, August, 1880. This will be left at a little trading store as we pass tomorrow morning, with the hope that it will soon be taken on to Benton and posted. So far the trip has been delightful, and every bit as nice as I had anticipated. The day we left the post was more than hot. It was simply scorching, and my whole face on the right side, ear and all, was blistered before we got to the ferry. Just now I am going through a process of peeling which is not beautifying, and is most painful. Before we had come 2 miles, it was discovered that a washer was lacking on one of the wheels of a wagon, and a man was sent back on a mule to get one. This caused a delay and made Faye cross, for it really was inexcusable in the wagon master to send a wagon out on a trip like this in that condition. The doctor did not start with the command, but rode up while we were waiting for the man with the washer. The soldiers were lounging on the ground near the wagons, talking and laughing, but when they saw the doctor coming, there was perfect silence over there, and I watched and listened, curious to see what effect the funny sight would have upon them. First one sat up, then another, and some stood up, then some one of them giggled, and that was quite enough to start every one of them to laughing. They were too far away for the laughing and snickering to be disrespectful, or even to be noticed much, but I knew why they laughed, for I laughed too. The doctor did not present a military appearance. He is the very smallest man I ever saw, and he was on a government horse that is known by its great height, 16 hands and 2 inches, I believe, and the little man's stirrups were about halfway down the horse's sides, and his knees almost on the horse's back. All 3 of us are wearing officers' white cork helmets, but the doctor's is not a success, being ever so much too large for his small head. Consequently it had tilted back and found a resting place on his shoulders, covering his ears and the upper part of his already hot face. For a whip he carried a little switch not much longer than his gauntlets, and which would have puzzled the big horse if struck by it. With it all, the little man could not ride, and as his government saddle was evidently intended for a big person, he seemed uncertain as to which was the proper place to sit, the pommel, the middle, or the curved back. All during that first day's march the soldiers watched him. I knew this, although we were at the head of the column, for every time he would start his horse up a little, I could hear smothered laughter back of us. It was late when we finally got across the Missouri on the funny ferry boat, so we camped for the night on this side near the ferryman's house. It was the doctor's first experience in camp, and of course he did not know how to make himself comfortable. He suffered from the heat, and became still warmer by rushing up and down, fanning himself and fighting mosquitoes. Then after dinner he had his horse saddled, a soldier helped him to mount, and he rode back and forth bobbing all sorts of ways, until Faye could stand it no longer, and told him to show some mercy to the beast that had carried him all day, and would have to do the same for days to come. Most of the camps have been in beautiful places, always by some clear stream, where often there was good trout fishing. In 1 or 2 of these we found grayling, a very gamey fish that many epicures consider more delicate than the trout. We have a fine way of keeping fish for the following day. As soon as possible after they have been caught, we pack them in long, wet grass, and put them in a cool spot, and in this way they will keep remarkably fresh. We have had an abundance of game, too, all kinds of grouse and prairie chicken, and the men killed 1 antelope. The Chinaman thought that Faye shot quite too many birds, and began to look cross when they were brought in, which annoyed me exceedingly, and I was determined to stop it. So one evening, after Faye had taken some young chicken to the cook tent, I said to the doctor, "Come with me," and going over to the tent I picked up the birds and went to some trees near by, and handing the doctor one, asked him to help me pick them, at the same time commencing to pull the feathers out of one myself. The poor doctor looked as though he was wishing he had made a specialty of dementia, and stood like a goose, looking at the chicken. Charlie soon became very restless, went inside the tent, and then came out, humming all the time. Finally he gave in, and coming over to us, fairly snatched the birds from me and said, "Me fixee him," and carried the whole bunch back to his tent, where we could not see him. Since that evening Charlie has been the most delighted one in camp when Faye has brought birds in. All the way we have had only a faint trail to follow, and often even that could not be seen after we had crossed a stream. At such places Faye, the doctor, and I would spread out and search for it. As Bettie and I were always put in the middle, we were usually the finders. One day we came up a hill that was so steep that 12 mules had to be hitched to each wagon in order to get it up. Another day we went down a hill where the trail was so sidling that the men had to fasten big ropes to the upper side of each wagon to hold it right side up as it was drawn down. Another day we made only a few miles because of the deep cut banks of a narrow little stream that wound around and across a valley, and which we had to cross 8 times. At every crossing the banks had to be sloped off and the bed built up before the wagons could be drawn over. Watching all this has been most entertaining, and the whole trip is making a man of the doctor. Tonight we are in camp in the Judith Basin and by the Judith River, a beautiful stream, and by far the largest we have seen on the march. And just across the river from us is a stockade, very high and very large, with heavy board gate that was closed as we came past. We can see the roof of the cabin inside and a stovepipe sticking up through it. Faye says that he has just heard that the place is a nest of horse thieves of the boldest and most daring type, and that one of them is coming to see him this evening. He was told all this by the Frenchman Junot, who has a little trading store a mile or so from here. Faye and the doctor rode over there as soon as the tents had been pitched, to ascertain if the company from Missoula had passed. Our trail and the one from the Bitter Root Valley fork there. The company passed several days ago, so we will go on in the morning, otherwise we would have been obliged to wait for it. I had to stay here all alone, as Faye would not consent to my going with him. He gave me one of his big pistols, and I had my own small one, and these I put on a table in the tent after they had gone, and then fastened the tent flaps tight and sat down to wait events. But the tent soon became stifling, and it occurred to me that it was foolish to shut myself up so I could not see whatever might come until it was right upon me. So, putting my pistol in my pocket and hiding the other, I opened the tent and went out. The first thing I saw was a fishing pole with line and fly, and that I took, and the next was the first sergeant watching me. I knew then that Faye had told him to take care of me. I went over to tell him that I was going for a fish, and then on down to the beautiful river, whose waters are green and very much the color of the Niagara River. I cast the fly over on the water, and instantly a large fish came up, took the fly, and went down again so easily and gracefully that he scarcely made a ripple on the water until he felt the pull of the line. That was when I forgot everything connected with camp, Faye, horse thieves, and Indians. I had no reel, of course, and getting the big fish out of the water was a problem, for I was standing on a rather high and steep bank. It jumped and jerked in a way that made me afraid I might be pulled down instead of my pulling the fish up. So I began to draw him in and then up, hand over hand, not daring to breathe while he was suspended in the air. It called for every bit of my strength, as the shiny thing was so heavy, but I got him in, and his length was just twice the width of my handkerchief, a splendid salmon trout. I laid it back of a rock in the shade and went on down the stream, casting my one fly, and very soon I caught another trout of precisely the same size as the first, and which I landed the same way, too. I put it by the rock with the other. I kept on down the river, whipping it with my lucky fly every few steps, but I caught no more fish, neither did I get a rise. But I did not mind that, for I had the two beauties, and I was having a grand time, too. I had caught both large fish without assistance and with a common willow pole. All that serenity was upset, however, when I heard my name called with such a roar that I came near jumping over the bank to save myself from whatever was after me. But the "What are you doing so far from camp?" came just in time to stop me. It was Faye, of course, and he was cross because I had gone so far alone, and had, in a way, disregarded his instructions, had done as I pleased after he had left me alone. I wanted to go to Junot's, therefore was not one bit sorry that I had frightened him, and said not a word to his sputtering about the danger from Indians and horse thieves as we started back to camp. After we had gone a little distance up, I said, "I left something by that rock." I tried to lift the big fish to show him, but they were too heavy, and I had to hold up one at a time as I said, "This is Mr. Indian, and this is Mr. Horse Thief." Faye was almost speechless over my having caught two such large trout, and started to camp with them at such a pace I had to run almost to keep up. He thought of something of great importance to say to the first sergeant, simply because he wanted to show them to the company. Some beautiful trout have been brought in by the enlisted men who went up the river, and I am so glad, for now they will have such a nice supper. The horse thieves undoubtedly knew this country well when they selected this valley for their hiding place. They have an abundance of delicious fish the year round at their very door, and there is any amount of game near, both furred and feathered, and splendid vegetables they can certainly raise, for they have just sent Faye a large grain sack overflowing with tender, sweet corn, new beets, turnips, cabbage, and potatoes. These will be a grand treat to us, as our own vegetables gave out several days ago. But just think of accepting these things from a band of desperadoes and horse thieves! Their garden must be inside the immense stockade, for there is nothing of the kind to be seen outside. They probably keep themselves in readiness for a long siege by sheriff and posse that may come down upon them at any time without warning, and all the time they know that if ever caught stealing horses, their trial will last just as long as it will take to drag them to a tree that has a good, strong branch. Charlie says that he is a Mason, and reads every evening in a book that is of his own printing. It is really wonderful. Every evening after dinner he sits out in front of his tent with a large silk handkerchief over his head, and perhaps another with which to fight the ever-present mosquitoes, and reads until dark. He is the only literary person in the command, and we are quite proud of him. He is a great comfort to Faye and me, for his cooking is delicious. The doctor has a camp appetite now, and is not as finicky as when we started on the trip. End of letter. Fort Maginnis, Montana Territory, September, 1880. It is almost 1 week since we got here, but I have not written before, as no mail has been sent out. I hope that the letter left with Junot has been received, also the 2 or 3 notes that were given to horsemen we met on their way to Fort Benton. At first, Faye did not tell me all that he knew about those horse thieves in the Judith Basin, but it finally came out that the trader Junot had told him a most blood-curdling tale of events to come. He had declared most positively that the desperadoes were planning to attack the command the very next morning while crossing the Judith Mountains, with the hope, of course, of getting the animals. He also told Faye that one of them would be in camp that evening to ask permission to go with him to Maginnis. Faye said the whole story was absurd, particularly the attack, as those horse thieves would never dare attack government troops. Besides, he had over 50 good men with him, and probably there were only 10 or 12 horse thieves, so not much attention was paid to what the old Frenchman had said. But after dinner, when we were sitting outside and Faye and the doctor were smoking, a man came around the corner of the tent with long, swinging strides, and was in our midst before we had dreamed of anyone being near. He spoke to Faye courteously, and declining a chair, dropped down full length on the ground, with elbows in the grass and chin on the palms of his hands. His feet were near the tent and his face out, which placed him in a fine position to observe everything in the camp without anyone seeing that he was doing so, especially as his eyes were screened by a soft, broad-brimmed hat. It was impossible to see their color, of course. He was young, not over 28 or 30, and handsome, with a face that was almost girlish in its fairness. His hair was neatly cut, and so was his light mustache, and his smooth face showed that he had recently shaved. He was tall and lithe, and from his chin to his toes was dressed in fine buckskin, shirt, trousers, leggings, and moccasins, and around his neck was tied a blue cotton handkerchief, new and clean. That the man could be a horse thief, an outlaw, seemed most incredible. He talked very well, too, of the country and the game, and we were enjoying the change in our usual after-dinner camp conversation, when suddenly up he jumped, and turning around looked straight at Faye, and then like a bomb came the request to be allowed to go with him to Fort Maginnis. He raised the brim of his hat, and there seemed to be a look of defiance in his steel blue eyes. But Faye had been expecting this, and knowing that he was more than a match for the villain, he got up from his camp stool leisurely, and with great composure told the man, "Certainly, I will be very glad to have someone along who knows the trail so well." To be told that he knew the trail must have been disconcerting to the man, but not one word did he say in reference to it. After he had gone, Faye went over to the company, where he remained some time, and I learned later that he had been giving the first sergeant careful instructions for the next day. I could not sleep that night because of horrible dreams, dreams of long yellow snakes with fiery eyes crawling through green grass. I have thought so many times since of how perfectly maddening it must have been to those horse thieves to have 22 nice fat mules and 3 horses brought almost within the shadow of their very own stockade, and yet have it so impossible to gather them in. At the appointed time the buckskin man appeared the following morning on a beautiful chestnut horse with fancy bridle and Mexican saddle, and with him came a friend, his pal, he told Faye, who was much older and was a sullen, villainous-looking man. Both were armed with rifles and pistols, but there was nothing remarkable in that. In this country it is a necessity. We started off very much as usual, except that Faye kept rather close to the pal, which left Bettie and me alone most of the time, just a little at one side. I noticed that directly back of the horse thieves walked a soldier, armed with rifle and pistol, and Faye told me that night that he was one of the best sharpshooters in the army, and that he was back of those men with orders to shoot them down like dogs if they made one treacherous move. The buckskin man was one of the most graceful riders I ever saw, and evidently loved his fine mount, as I saw him stroke his neck several times, and the man himself was certainly handsome. Faye had told me that I must not question anything he might tell me to do, so after we had crossed the valley and gone up the mountains a little distance, he called to me in a voice unnecessarily loud that I must be tired riding so far, and had better get in the ambulance for a while. I immediately dismounted, and giving the bridle rein to a soldier, I waited for the ambulance to come up. As I got in, I felt that perhaps I was doing the first act in an awful tragedy. The horsemen and wagons had stopped during the minute or two I was getting in, but I saw soldiers moving about, and just as soon as I was seated I looked out to see what was going on. A splendid old sergeant was going to the front with 4 soldiers, whom I knew were men to be trusted, each one with rifle, bayonet, and belt full of cartridges, and then I saw that some of the plans for that day's trip had not been told to me. The men were placed in front of everyone, 4 abreast, and Faye at once told the thieves that under no condition must one ever get in front of the advance guard. How they must have hated it all, 4 drilled soldiers in front of them and a sharpshooter back of them, and all the time treated by Faye as honored guests. There were 4 men at the rear of the wagons, and the posting of these rear and advance guards, and placing men on either side of the wagons, had been done without one order from Faye, so my dismounting must have been the signal for the sergeant to carry out the orders Faye had given him the night before. Not by one turn of the head did those outlaws show that they noticed those changes. In that way we crossed the range. We met a dozen or more men of the very roughest type, each one heavily armed. They were in parties of 2 and 3, and Faye thinks that a signal was passed between one of them and the "pal," but there was no attack as had been predicted. What might have taken place, however, if Faye had not been prepared, no one can tell. Certainly part of Junot's story had been carried out. The horse thief came to the tent, and came with us to Maginnis, and it was not because he wanted the protection of the troops. Faye insists that an attack was never thought of, but as he was responsible for government property, including the animals, he had to make preparation to protect them. Of course those men wanted only the animals. We passed many places on the divide that were ideal for an ambush, bluffs, huge boulders and precipices, everything perfect for a successful hold-up. The men came on to the post with us, and were in camp 2 nights with the soldiers. The second day from the Judith we stopped for luncheon near a small stream where there were a great many chokecherry bushes, and Buckskin Joe, that was his name, brought large bunches of the cherries to me. His manner showed refinement, and I saw that his wonderful eyes could be tender as well as steely. Perhaps he had sisters at the old home, and perhaps, too, I was the first woman he had seen in months to remind him of them. I shall always believe that he is from good people some place east, that his daredevil nature got him into some kind of trouble there, and that he came to this wild country to hide from justice. The very morning after we got here, not long after our breakfast, he appeared at our tent with a fine young deer slung across the back of his horse, which he presented to us. He had just killed it. It was most acceptable, as there was no fresh meat in camp. He and his "pal" stayed around that day and night, and then quietly disappeared. Not one of the soldiers even saw them go. Footnote: About 6 years after this occurrence there was a graphic account in the Western papers of the horrible death of Buckskin Joe, who was known as one of the most daring and slippery horse thieves in the territory. After evading arrest many times, he was finally hunted down by a sheriff's posse, when his fiendish fighting excited the admiration of those who were killing him. A bullet broke one of his legs and he went down, but he kept on shooting, and so fast that no one dared approach him, and when the forearm of his pistol hand was shattered, he grasped the pistol with the other hand and continued to shoot, even when he could not sit up, but had to hold himself up by the elbow of his broken arm. He was finally killed, fairly riddled with bullets. He knew, of course, all the time what his fate would be if taken alive, and he chose the cold lead instead of the end of a rope. End of footnote. It was pleasant to meet our old friends here. Colonel Palmer is in command, and I was particularly glad to see them. After Mrs. Palmer had embraced me, she held me off a little and said, "What have you been doing to your face? My, but you are ugly! The skin on the blistered side has peeled off in little strips, leaving the new skin very white in between the parched brown of the old, so I expect I do resemble a zebra or an Indian with his war paint on." The post, which is only a camp as yet, is located at the upper end of a beautiful valley, and back of us is a cañon, and mountains are on both sides. Far down the valley is a large Indian village, and we can distinctly see the teepees, and often hear the tom-toms when the Indians dance. There are other Indian camps near, and it is not safe to go far from the tents without an escort. It seems to be a wonderful country for game: deer, grouse, and prairie chicken. Twice we have seen deer come down from the mountains and drink from the stream just below the post. Bettie and I have scared up chicken every time we have taken little runs around the camp, and Faye has shot large bags of them. They are not as great a treat to us as to our friends, for we had so many on the way over. We have 2 wall tents, one for sitting room and one for bedroom, and in front a fly has been stretched. Our folding camp furniture makes the tents very comfortable. Back of these is the mess or dining tent, and back of that is the cook tent. Charlie has a small range now, which keeps him squeaking or half singing all the time. One morning before we got this stove from the quartermaster, breakfast was late, very late. The wind was blowing a gale, and after waiting and waiting, we concluded that Charlie must be having trouble with the little sheet iron camp stove. So Faye went back to see what was the matter. He returned laughing, and said he had found a most unhappy Chinaman, that Charlie was holding the stove down with a piece of wood with one hand, and with the other was trying to keep the breakfast on the stove. You know the stovepipe goes up through a piece of tin fastened in the roof of the tent, which is slanting, and when the canvas catches the wind and flops up and down and every other way, the stovepipe naturally has to go with it. The wind was just right that morning to flop everything, canvas, pipe, stove, and breakfast too, particularly the delicate Saratoga chips Charlie had prepared for us, and which, Faye said, were being blown about like yellow rose leaves. The poor little heathen was distracted, but when he saw Faye he instantly became a general and said at once, "You hole him, me takee breakfast." So Faye, having a desire for breakfast, held down the stove while Charlie got things together. The Saratoga chips were delicate and crisp and looked nice too, but neither the doctor nor I asked Faye if they were some of the rose leaves or just plain potatoes from a dish. Charlie is splendid and most resourceful. Very near our tent is a small stream of cold, clear water, and on one side of this he has made a little cave of stones through which the water runs, and in this he keeps the butter, milk, and desserts that require a cool place. He is pottering around about something all the time. There is just one poor cow in the whole camp, so we cannot get much milk, only 1 pint each day, but we consider ourselves very fortunate in getting any at all. I brought over 14 dozen eggs, packed in boxes with salt. We are to start back the 1st of November, so after we got here I worked out a little problem in mathematics, and found that the eggs would last by using only 2 each day. But Charlie does better than this. He will manage to get along without eggs for a day or 2, and then will surprise us with a fine omelet or custard, but he keeps an exact account and never exceeds his allowance. The doctor is still with us, and shows no inclination to join the officers' mess that has just been started. He seems to think that he is one of the family, and would be greatly surprised and hurt, probably, if he should discover that we would rather be alone. End of letter. End of section 12.